Ethan Cole sat in the back seat of a sleek black town car. As it slid through the glowing avenues of Manhattan, the streets alive with Friday night energy, neon signs reflecting. Across the windshield, pedestrians rushing past with the carefree laughter of those who had nothing to lose. He was the man who had everything, at least on paper, a billionaire tech founder whose face appeared regularly on magazine covers, whose name carried the weight of power and innovation. Yet as he leaned his forehead against the cool glass and stared at the blur of taxis, the reflection staring back at him was hollow, marked by exhaustion and mistrust. Months earlier, the tabloids had christened him with a title he despised, the man who trusts no woman, and he hated it only because it rang so true. His breakup with Melissa Grant, the actress with the dazzling smile and claws hidden behind her laughter, had been televised to the entire nation. Paparazzi snapping shots of her storming from his penthouse, screaming about stock options and prenups, while Ethan stood still, his jaw clenched, his soul numb. That night taught him what money did to love, how affection twisted into transaction, how sincerity bent under the weight of wealth. Ethan swore never to be fooled again. Yet he also knew he could not spend his life locked in suspicion, so he decided to fight cynicism with cold logic, to test rather than to trust. He devised what he called the black card dating test, an experiment as ruthless as it was simple. Through a dating app, his security team created a disguised profile, hiding his true identity, portraying him only as Ethan, an entrepreneur with vague interests in books and long runs by the Hudson. Women would meet him without the filter of his celebrity. Then, at the perfect moment, he would present temptation incarnate, his unlimited credit card, and observe whether they could resist. The first trial unfolded in an upscale midtown restaurant. His date, a bright pink-dressed socialite named Chloe, squealed with delight as the dessert menu arrived. Ethan, with his practiced calm, slid the card across the table and said softly, "Use it for whatever you like." Her gasp echoed like the opening note of a symphony of greed. Within half an hour, Chloe was not discussing dessert anymore, but instructing the manager to arrange delivery of a massive massage chair for her poodle leather, customized imported in days. Ethan bit the inside of his cheek, hiding his disbelief. The black card was supposed to test loyalty, but Chloe had reduced it to a joke, a toy for her dog. The next evening, his resolve hardened further. He met Kendra, a tall influencer with cascading hair and a flawless smile, who within minutes set her phone against the salt shaker and went live on TikTok. When Ethan slid the card into her manicured fingers, her eyes flashed with calculation, and she whispered into the camera, "Look at this, the billionaire black card right here." Hearts and laughing emojis flooded her feed as she bragged to thousands that she was about to order champagne worth more than most people's rent. Ethan sat watching, invisible in his own date, as the woman across from him performed not for him, but for her audience, another actor in the endless theater of attention. By the week's end, Ethan had gathered enough evidence to cement his belief. Countless women could not resist. The black card turned affection into obsession, conversation into manipulation. Every smile, every compliment dissolved into the gleam of opportunity once the card appeared. He returned each night to his penthouse, its glass walls reflecting the Manhattan skyline, carrying with him not satisfaction, but a deeper hollowness. Each sip of scotch at midnight tasted of iron and loneliness. Yet beneath the layers of mistrust, a sliver of doubt flickered. Was he proving the truth or merely orchestrating it? Were these women simply acting the way he invited them to act? Was he searching for sincerity or building a cage to justify his own bitterness? He dismissed the questions with clenched fists and sharper resolve. He would continue until hope died completely. What Ethan could not know was that fate had already conspired against his experiment. A server crash in the app rerouted profiles. A host at a bustling downtown restaurant, overwhelmed by a crowded Friday rush, guided a young woman to the wrong table. Her name was Sophia Reed, a waitress and part-time student, drowning in loans yet carrying a quiet dream of writing children's books. She believed she was meeting a high school teacher from the app, not the man branded by tabloids as the billionaire who trusts no woman. She would sit across from Ethan Cole, unaware of his wealth, unarmed by calculation, and with eyes that saw not the card in his wallet, but the loneliness in his heart. The man who trusted no woman was about to discover that a single mistaken date could rewrite the story of his life. Ethan Cole had promised himself that he would not stop at 2 failed attempts. 2 absurd nights were not enough to draw a real conclusion, and so he continued with determination, scheduling more dates through the app his team had set up. Each meeting felt like a mirror reflecting the same truth, but he wanted the mirror to shatter beyond repair, leaving him no more illusions to chase. On Tuesday evening, he met with Julia, a young attorney whose resume sparkled with Ivy League credentials. She walked into the restaurant with a confident stride, her suit tailored to perfection, her smile polished like glass. For the first half hour, the conversation was refreshing. They spoke of literature, of her childhood in Boston, of Ethan's fabricated story as a modest entrepreneur. For a moment, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, this one would be different. But when the waiter laid down the check and Ethan casually slid the black card across the table, Julia's expression shifted. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Her hand lingered too long on the card, and then she leaned forward with a conspiratorial tone. "You know, she said there is a new condominium opening uptown, and I think you and I could pick a place together, something worth investing in." The sudden leap from conversation to property investment was jarring. Ethan sipped his water slowly, hiding the sinking weight in his stomach. Another woman who had turned the presence of the card into an invitation to escalate. That night, back in his penthouse, he marked her name with a single word in his notebook: failed. Wednesday brought Kendra's polar opposite, an influencer named Bella, who lived in Brooklyn but treated every night out like a red carpet event. Her arrival was accompanied by the soft click of stilettos and the rustle of designer fabric. They had not even ordered appetizers before she adjusted the lighting at their table, pulled out her phone, and began filming snippets of herself. With Ethan cropped halfway into the frame, she barely looked at him, her words drifting toward her unseen audience. When the black card appeared, she gasped theatrically, then held it up to the camera like a golden idol. "Look at this," she whispered. "Do you know how rare this is?" She encouraged her followers to comment on what she should buy first. Within seconds, the suggestions flooded in champagne jewelry, maybe even a quick trip to Paris. Ethan sat frozen a prop in her performance, his jaw tightening with every squeal. He was not a man anymore. He was content. By the time dessert arrived, She had spent thousands on items that would arrive at her loft by morning. Ethan paid silently, his eyes colder than the wine in his glass. Another night, another failure. Thursday should have felt routine by then, but it brought something sharper, something more bitter. The woman was named Dana, and at first she seemed different. She asked about his hobbies, laughed easily at his dry jokes, and even reached across the table to touch his hand. For half an hour, Ethan allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. But while she excused herself to the restroom, her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message preview. "Girl, I think I hit the jackpot tonight. The guy's loaded. I will get him to buy me something crazy." Ethan's stomach twisted, his hand clenched into a fist against his thigh. When Dana returned, he slid the black card onto the table, anyway watching closely. Her eyes lit up with the same gleam he had seen too many times before. She spoke sweetly, but the betrayal already dripped between every word. That night he closed his notebook with a slam and whispered to himself countless girls could not resist. Each date left him more certain of his own cynicism, more convinced that his test was flawless in its cruelty. He had gathered enough evidence to prove his thesis. Women could not be trusted when temptation shimmered in front of them. Yet amidst his growing bitterness, another presence was moving quietly in the background. Melissa Grant, the actress who had once shared his bed and now despised his coldness, had caught wind of his experiment. Through mutual acquaintances and whispers in social circles, she learned that Ethan was staging secret dates with anonymous women, and Melissa, who had always thrived on spectacle, decided this was her opportunity to strike back. She hired a pair of paparazzi to trail Ethan's movements, promising them exclusives that would sell like wildfire. If she could not have his heart, she would at least have his humiliation. As Ethan sat alone one night, staring at the skyline glass of scotch in hand, he believed he was in full control of his experiment. He thought he was writing the rules, orchestrating every detail, predicting every outcome. He did not realize that Melissa was rewriting the margins of his story with venom and ambition. He did not realize that the world he built to test women was about to test him in ways he could not imagine. All he knew was that the black card had become his truth, that countless women had failed, and that he was preparing for yet another date. What he did not know was that the next one would not be like the others. A glitch in the app, a crowded restaurant, a mistaken seating arrangement. A woman who walked into his life not for wealth, not for performance, but simply because fate pulled her chair out at the wrong table. Her name was Sophia Reed, and she was about to turn Ethan's cruel little test upside down. The restaurant on that Friday evening buzzed with the kind of chaotic energy only New York could create, tables crowded servers, rushing with trays of cocktails and plates that sizzled in the air, conversations layering over one another in a symphony of voices. Sophia Reed walked through the doors, clutching the strap of her modest purse, trying not to let the nerves on her face betray her excitement. She had agreed to this blind date on the app because her roommate insisted she deserved something better than the endless hours waitressing at a diner and writing stories by candlelight in their cramped apartment. The app had matched her with a man described as a high school teacher who loved literature and hiking. That sounded safe, ordinary, even comforting. And for someone like Sophia, who had seen too much disappointment, ordinary felt like hope. At the same time, across the city, Ethan Cole stepped into the same restaurant. His usual calm mask in place, his posture carrying the quiet confidence of a man used to power. Tonight was just another date in his black card test, another evening to prove the same cynical truth he had already written into his heart. His security detail stayed outside, while he entered alone, choosing to appear approachable. He gave his name at the host's stand, and a harried young man nodded, waving him toward the back, without a second glance at the seating chart. At that exact moment, Sophia arrived at the same stand and gave her name. The host glanced down at the jumble of scribbled notes on the chart, thought he saw the right one, and with the rush of a dozen other demands, pointed her toward the same table Ethan was heading to. A server just as overwhelmed gestured to the chair across from him and smiled, believing it was correct. Sophia hesitated only for a moment before sitting down. When Ethan looked up and saw her, his breath caught, though he quickly disguised it as a polite smile. She was not like the women he had been meeting. There was no shimmering designer gown, no calculated tilt of the head for attention, only a simple dress eyes that searched his face with genuine curiosity and a nervous laugh as she settled into her seat. "Sorry," she said, "traffic was worse than I thought." Ethan almost corrected her, almost explained that there must have been a mistake, but something in her presence made him pause. Instead, he nodded. "No problem, I just got here." They both assumed they were meeting the person from the app. Sophia thought he was the school teacher profile she had seen, and Ethan believed she was another match sent to him for his ongoing experiment. The first minutes unfolded with the awkward politeness of strangers trying to find common ground. Sophia spoke of her classes at the university, how she balanced shifts at the diner with her dream of finishing a manuscript for children's stories. She laughed at herself, admitting she sometimes wrote ideas on napkins during breaks. Ethan listened, surprised by the absence of pretension. She asked him questions that no one had asked in years. "What kind of books do you like? Do you ever get lonely running your own company?" He deflected smoothly, hiding his real identity, but her questions lingered, pricking at the armor he wore daily. Dinner arrived, and Ethan noticed how she ate slowly, savoring not out of performance, but necessity, as if every bite mattered. When the waiter returned with the check, Sophia instinctively reached for her wallet. Ethan almost chuckled because in every previous date, the women had leaned back, waiting for him to cover everything, or eagerly suggested ways to use the black card. But Sophia placed her modest leather wallet on the table and said firmly, "We should split this." Ethan shook his head gently. "Allow me." But she insisted, eyes narrowing in determination. "No, it is fair this way." In the end, they compromised the bill, divided evenly, though he easily could have paid for the whole restaurant. Something in that moment pressed into Ethan's chest. She was the first person in months who did not want to take advantage, who did not measure the evening by what she could gain. Then came the moment that sealed itself into his memory. Sophia asked the waiter to pack up her unfinished entree. Ethan assumed she would take it home for herself, but as they left the restaurant, she explained softly that her roommate had not eaten well all week, and this would help. Ethan followed her out into the evening air, the city humming with its relentless rhythm, and something about her explanation lingered long after. As they walked toward the corner, rain began to fall, first a sprinkle, then a downpour. Without hesitation, Ethan shrugged off his jacket and held it over her head, guiding her beneath the awning of a small bookstore, still lit from within. They both laughed breathless, and when Sophia glanced at the display window and pointed out a children's book she had loved as a child, Ethan saw a light in her eyes he could not ignore. Inside the bookstore, dripping slightly from the rain, Sophia flipped through the worn pages of a second-hand copy, reading aloud a silly passage. Ethan found himself laughing genuinely, not the polite chuckles he offered at board meetings or charity galas, but laughter that rose from some long-buried place. For the first time since Melissa's betrayal, he forgot to guard himself. He forgot the test, the card, the notebook filled with names and failures. Sitting beside Sophia in that cramped little shop, he only felt the rare comfort of being seen. As they parted that night, Sophia thanked him with a smile that reached her eyes. Ethan watched her disappear into the rain-slicked streets, his hand still warm from where she had touched his arm lightly. He stood frozen, knowing something impossible had just happened. His entire experiment had been built to prove that love was dead, that temptation destroyed truth. Yet here was a woman who had walked into his life by mistake, resisted without even realizing there was a test, and left him shaken in ways he could not yet understand. Ethan Cole, the man who trusted no woman, found himself waiting for the next time he could see her again, not as part of an experiment, but because for the first time in years he wanted to. Ethan Cole found himself waking the next morning with a feeling he had not experienced in years, a peculiar lightness that hovered between curiosity and unease. He replayed the evening in his mind, the moment Sophia insisted on splitting the bill, the way she tucked the leftovers carefully into her bag for her roommate, the unself-conscious laughter in the bookstore as rain dripped from her hair. It was not part of his plan, not part of the controlled experiment he had so carefully constructed. He reminded himself that this had all been an accident, a misrouted profile, a restaurant host's mistake, yet something in him resisted the impulse to file it away as just another coincidence. For the first time since the black card dating test began, he wanted to see someone again, not for data, but for himself. When he reached out through the app, pretending it was deliberate, Sophia responded with simple warmth, agreeing to meet for coffee in a quiet cafe tucked between a record store and a florist in Brooklyn. She arrived in a faded denim jacket, her hair pulled back loosely, carrying a notebook stuffed with scribbled pages. Ethan had grown used to women who arrived with designer handbags and phones buzzing with notifications. Sophia slipped her phone into her bag and ignored it entirely. She ordered the cheapest latte on the menu, then smiled across the table and asked him what his favorite childhood book was. Ethan stumbled, not because he did not have an answer, but because no one had asked him that since he was a boy. He said slowly, "The Velveteen Rabbit," and her whole face lit with recognition. "That was mine too," she whispered, pulling a folded page from her notebook and showing him a sketch. She had been working on a rabbit with long ears inked with tenderness. Ethan traced the drawing with his eyes feeling something inside his chest stir. The conversation flowed easily. Sophia told him about her job at the diner, how she carried trays until her arms ached, how she sometimes wrote on napkins during breaks, weaving stories about children who found magic in ordinary corners of the world. She confessed that she often doubted herself, that rejection letters stacked on her desk but still she kept writing because it was the only way she felt truly alive. Ethan listened, absorbing every word, struck by how different she was from the women he had tested before. There was no performance, no angle, no carefully crafted image for others to admire. She was simply herself, raw and unpolished, and that made her shine brighter than any diamond he had ever seen. When they left the cafe, a light drizzle had begun. Ethan instinctively reached for his umbrella, but Sophia shook her head and laughed, tilting her face upward to feel the rain. She darted forward, pulling him by the sleeve, and they ran through the narrow streets until they ducked into a small independent bookstore to escape the downpour. Inside, the smell of paper and ink embraced them. Sophia wandered between shelves, trailing her fingers along spines, pulling out titles she loved. At one shelf she stopped and handed him a slim book of children's poetry. "Read one," she urged. Ethan hesitated, but under her expectant gaze, he opened the book and read softly. His voice, usually reserved for commanding boardrooms, softened into rhythm. And as he read, he caught Sophia smiling not at the words, but at him. That smile disarmed him more than any test could. She reached into her bag and produced a small notebook, flipping to a page where she had drafted the beginning of her own story. It was about a lonely boy who discovered a hidden garden where toys came to life. She asked him to read it aloud, and though his voice trembled at first, by the second page, he was immersed, the words carrying both of them into another world. When he finished, Sophia looked at him as if he had given her a gift. "No one has ever read my work out loud before," she admitted quietly. "It sounded better than I imagined." Ethan felt a warmth bloom in his chest, unfamiliar and almost frightening. Later, as they walked through Central Park, the rain cleared and the air smelled of earth and grass. Children ran past with kites, and Sophia stopped to watch, her eyes soft. She told him she had grown up without much, often relying on the kindness of neighbors, and that was why she dreamed of writing stories that gave children hope. Ethan could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him about hope without asking for money. He felt his defenses cracking, a dangerous vulnerability seeping in. At a bench near the lake, they sat with coffees in hand. Sophia pulled one earbud from her pocket, offering it to him. "Listen," she said. It was an old jazz piece, slow and haunting, the kind of music Ethan's father used to play in their living room before his family fractured under the pressure of wealth. He closed his eyes, letting the notes wash over him, and when he opened them, Sophia was watching him with an expression that was both curious and tender. He realized she saw through him, not to his money or his name, but to his loneliness. For a moment, he wanted to tell her everything, to admit who he really was, but the fear of shattering this fragile connection kept him silent. That evening ended with a simple walk to her subway stop. Sophia hugged him lightly, the kind of embrace that was neither rehearsed nor obligatory, and whispered, "I am glad the app made this match." Ethan stood frozen. Long after, she disappeared into the crowd, his heart pounding with a rhythm he did not recognize. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by glass and steel, he replayed the day in fragments. Her laughter as they ran through the rain, the sound of his own voice reading her story, the quiet way she had looked at him as though she glimpsed the truth beneath the armor. For years he had believed that money corrupted every gesture of affection, that sincerity could not survive in the shadow of wealth. Yet Sophia Reed, a young woman carrying debt and dreams, had managed to reach through his walls with nothing more than her authenticity. It terrified him as much as it thrilled him. Ethan Cole, the man who trusted no woman, lay awake that night, realizing he was already breaking his own rule. He wanted to see her again, not to test her, not to observe, but because he craved the way she made the world feel lighter. The black card lying silent in his wallet had lost its power in her presence. Ethan Cole had never been a man who second-guessed his own strategies yet. After those unexpected afternoons with Sophia Reed, he found himself caught in a storm of contradiction. He wanted to let down his guard, to abandon the experiment that had once felt like armor, but habit and fear pressed him to continue. Was she truly different, or had she simply mastered a subtler game, playing innocence until the right moment? The doubt gnawed at him, whispering of Melissa's betrayal, of the countless women who had smiled sweetly, only to reveal their hunger when the black card gleamed under the light. So Ethan resolved to create one final trial, not cruel or extravagant like the others, but quiet and telling. He would place the temptation in her hands without warning, observe her choices, and finally know whether his instincts were betraying him. The opportunity came on a Saturday evening when he invited Sophia to meet him at a modest Italian cafe in the East Village. It was the kind of place where college students wrote essays over cheap espresso and elderly couples shared bowls of pasta. Sophia arrived with her notebook tucked under her arm cheeks, flushed from the cold. They ate, simply laughing about the eccentric waiter who recited the specials like a Shakespearean actor. And for a time, Ethan almost forgot why he had brought her there. But when the bill arrived, he patted his pockets with exaggerated frustration, murmuring, "I must have left my wallet in the car." Sophia immediately offered to cover her half, but Ethan shook his head, slipping the black card from his jacket and laying it before her. "Can you handle this for me just this once?" he said casually, as if it meant nothing. Her eyes widened at the weight of the card, at the black gleam that spoke of unlimited power. She hesitated, biting her lip, then finally nodded and handed it to the waiter. Ethan watched every flicker of her expression, every subtle shift in her posture, expecting the familiar spark of greed. But none came. After paying, she slipped the card back toward him with a look that was almost apologetic, as if she had borrowed something fragile and was eager to return it unscathed. Later that night, curiosity tugged at her. She still carried her notebook, so she ducked into a used bookstore before heading home, choosing 2 battered children's novels that cost barely more than pocket change. She bought them with her own dwindling cash, rather than reach for the card again. Ethan, who had quietly followed at a distance with his driver, parked nearby, saw everything. Relief brushed through him, but still he waited. Perhaps the real test would emerge when she thought he was not watching. The next day, Sophia stood in line at a bakery, the card tucked inside her purse, after Ethan insisted she keep it for emergencies. When her turn came, she purchased 24 plain donuts and carried them across town to the homeless shelter where she volunteered. Ethan arrived minutes later, blending into the crowd outside, and what he saw pierced straight through the cynicism that had armored his heart. Sophia, in her faded coat and worn shoes, was laughing as she handed out donuts to children whose eyes lit up at the simple treat. She crouched to tie a little boy's shoelaces, wiped sugar from a girl's cheek, and never once mentioned where the donuts had come from. Ethan realized that she could have bought anything: jewelry, clothes, gadgets, but she had chosen to bring sweetness to children who had nothing. The image seared into his memory: Sophia kneeling on the cold floor, powdered sugar dusting her fingers, her face glowing with unguarded joy. This was the signature moment his test had never produced before. Later, when he approached her outside, she shrugged off his gratitude. "It was just donuts," she said with a smile. But to Ethan, it was a revelation. That evening, unable to silence the turmoil inside him, Ethan replayed the sight over and over. He remembered the influencer flaunting the card to her followers, the socialite buying a massage chair for her dog, the attorney angling for real estate. Then he thought of Sophia, who had turned temptation into generosity without expecting anything in return. Still, suspicion clung to him like smoke. Was it possible she knew who he really was, that she was performing the part of goodness to capture his heart? The thought made him restless. He called his assistant, instructing a discreet background check, though even as he gave the order, shame coiled in his chest. Sophia had given him no reason to doubt her, but old scars were not easily healed. Days later, the report came back clean. Sophia Reed, 22 years old, waitress at a diner, full-time student in English literature. No criminal record, no suspicious ties. A young woman who had lived through hardship with dignity, who carried debt but also dreams, whose life was ordinary, except for the extraordinary kindness she spread quietly. Ethan stared at the report for a long time, then tossed it aside. Paper could not capture the warmth of her laughter or the gentleness in her eyes. He wanted to believe those things were real, not a mask. The following week, he invited her again, this time to Central Park on a crisp afternoon. He brought 2 coffees, and together they sat on a bench, overlooking the lake, sharing headphones to listen to a jazz playlist. At one point, Ethan made a clumsy move, spilling coffee on himself, and Sophia burst into laughter before dabbing at his shirt with a napkin, teasing him gently. It was such a simple moment, yet it struck him harder than any grand gesture could. He realized that he felt alive in her presence, not because of what she did with his card, but because she treated him as if he were human, not a headline. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and lavender, Ethan's test was already unraveling. He had wanted proof, but proof was no longer enough. He wanted her. The black card lay forgotten in his pocket, a symbol of everything that had failed him before. Watching Sophia hum softly to the music, Ethan knew that whether she passed or failed no longer mattered. The test had turned on him, and in losing control, he had found something far more dangerous. He had found hope. Ethan Cole had always measured his days in meetings and mergers in deadlines and acquisitions in the relentless pace of a life that demanded precision and control. But since Sophia Reed had entered his world by mistake, his calendar began to look different, filled with small blocks of time that had nothing to do with boardrooms and everything to do with her. He found himself taking the subway for the first time in years, just because she said she liked watching people's stories unfold in the crowded cars. And though his security detail protested, he went anyway. Standing beside her as the train rattled through dark tunnels, his tailored suit brushing against her thrift store jacket, both of them laughing as they tried to keep balance. She teased him for looking out of place, but when an older woman stumbled, Ethan reached out instinctively to steady her, and Sophia's eyes softened at the sight, as if she were seeing past the billionaire to the man underneath. Their afternoons became a collection of simple moments, but each one carved itself into Ethan's memory with more force than any luxury gala he had ever attended. In Central Park, he watched Sophia close her eyes as the wind caught her hair, listened to her laugh when a kite dipped low enough to almost hit her, felt her shoulder brush his as they sat on a bench feeding ducks. She pulled out her notebook one day, shyly offering him a story draft. It was about a girl who found magic in a library basement, where forgotten books whispered secrets to those willing to listen. Ethan read silently for a while, then allowed his voice unsteady but earnest, and Sophia closed her eyes smiling, as if hearing her own words brought them to life in a way she had never imagined. He realized he wanted to be the first to hear all her stories, not because he was testing her, but because her words made him believe in something beyond profit margins and market shares. One evening they sat in a crowded Brooklyn cafe, squeezed together at a small table near the window, headphones split between them, listening to a playlist Sophia had made. When a song by an old jazz artist began, Ethan confessed that his father used to play that record in their house before everything fell apart. Sophia looked at him with quiet empathy, no judgment, no curiosity to pry into his wealth, only understanding, and the moment felt so intimate that Ethan had to look away before he said more than he was ready to. When he reached for his cup, his hand knocked it over coffee, spilling across the table and onto his shirt. For a split second, he braced himself for scorn or laughter, but Sophia only grabbed napkins, pressing them against his shirt, while grinning playfully. "Clumsy billionaire," she teased, and for the first time he laughed at his own imperfection, realizing she made room for his flaws in a way no one else had. As days turned into weeks, their closeness grew in quiet increments. They wandered through bookstores, Sophia pointing out children's classics, while Ethan listened like a student. They shared street food at night, greasy pizza slices eaten on stoops, while neon lights flickered overhead. They watched a street musician play violin in the subway station, and Ethan moved by. The music dropped a bill into the open case, only to see Sophia slip in half her tips from her diner shift as well. She gave generously even when she had so little, and Ethan's chest tightened each time he witnessed her kindness. The black card remained in her purse untouched, except for small necessities, and Ethan realized he no longer cared about monitoring it. He cared about her smile when she told him she had passed an exam, about the way her eyes lit up when she read a passage aloud, about the warmth of her hand brushing his in accidental touches that lingered longer each time. Their chemistry unfolded naturally, not with grand declarations, but with stolen glances, shared laughter, and moments of silence that felt comfortable instead of strained. One night they took the subway to Coney Island, walking along the boardwalk under the glow of carnival lights. Sophia insisted they ride the Ferris wheel, and though Ethan felt foolish queuing among teenagers, he went. At the top, as the city stretched like a jeweled blanket in the distance, Sophia leaned her head against his shoulder, whispering, "I never thought life could feel this beautiful with so little." Ethan closed his eyes, overcome by a tenderness he had not allowed himself in years. He wanted to tell her then, to confess everything, to throw away the experiment, and reveal who he truly was. but fear strangled the words. He worried she would see him differently, that the magic between them would dissolve once the weight of his wealth crashed into the fragile simplicity they shared. So he stayed silent, holding her closer as the wheel descended. Each night he returned to his penthouse, a place that had once been a monument to his success. But now it felt like a cage, without her laughter echoing through its walls. He would lie awake, imagining her bent over her notebook, scribbling stories by lamplight. Her lips curved in concentration, her hair falling loose across her face. He had tested her, and she had passed in ways he had not expected, but now the real test was his own heart. Could he trust again? Could he risk letting someone so pure into a life shadowed by scandal and betrayal? The man who had sworn to trust no woman was falling, not with suspicion, but with hope. And that hope terrified him more than any failure ever could. Ethan Cole, once defined by his cynicism, found himself waiting for each new moment with Sophia Reed, counting hours until he could hear her laugh again, until he could feel the brush of her hand, until he could believe, if only for a fleeting instant, that love was not a transaction, but the one truth worth risking everything for. The crisp bite of early autumn air had settled over New York, and Ethan Cole found himself walking beside Sophia Reed in Central Park, one late afternoon leaves crunching underfoot as children tossed handfuls of gold and amber into the air. He had never felt more at peace, but peace rarely lasted long in his world. Across the street, hidden lenses tracked their every move, orchestrated by Melissa, the actress X, who had tasted blood since the day Ethan's black card dating test made its way into whispers among the tabloids. She had heard rumors of Ethan disappearing from his high society circle, skipping fundraisers and black tie galas, spending time with a waitress of all people. For Melissa, this was not only a personal insult, but a potential headline, and headlines were her weapon. She unleashed paparazzi at just the right moment. One photographer captured Sophia laughing as Ethan handed her the black card to cover their modest cafe bill. Another snapped when Sophia slid it into her purse afterward. The images told a story far removed from the truth, and Melissa knew the public would eat it up. 2 days later, the headlines stretched across every gossip column and trending feed: waitress caught with billionaire's unlimited black card. The accompanying article painted Sophia as a gold digger who had lured Ethan into her modest world only to exploit his wealth. Screenshots appeared of her standing outside a bookstore with bags of her smiling at children near a shelter, all twisted into evidence of opportunism. Sophia read the words on her phone as she rode the subway home from class, her heart lurching into her stomach. The strangers around her laughed at memes based on the headline, not knowing the woman in those grainy photos was sitting just 3 feet away, shrinking into herself with shame. When Ethan called, her voice was trembling. "Is it true?" Ethan asked gently, trying to steady himself against the old wound of betrayal. "Did you use the card for yourself?" For appearances, Sophia's chest constricted. "Is that what you think of me after everything?" Her eyes brimmed with tears as she clutched the phone. "I never asked for your card. I never asked for anything." Ethan tried to explain, tried to reassure, but the images, the headlines, the memories of women who had failed his test all gnawed at his confidence. "I want to believe you," he whispered, but she cut him off. "Want to believe? That means you don't. That means you already doubt me." The words sliced deep, and Sophia hung up before he could respond. She walked the rest of the way home with her head low, her chest burning with betrayal. She had told herself Ethan was different, that he saw her beyond her worn shoes and thrifted clothes, but in one breath he had reduced her to just another suspect. Ethan sat in his penthouse that night, the skyline glowing against the glass walls, the weight of guilt pressing against his ribs. James, his assistant, laid the tabloids on the table. Sir Melissa's fingerprints are all over this. The timing, the photographers, the spin. Ethan clenched his jaw. But the damage was done. The world saw Sophia as a thief, and his hesitation when she begged for trust had only deepened the wound. Sophia refused his calls for days, throwing herself into shifts at the diner, into classwork, into anything that would numb the ache. But the whispers followed her. Customers recognized her, asked if she was really dating a billionaire, if she really had his black card. Some smirked, some sneered. Her manager pulled her aside and suggested maybe she should take some time off until things calmed down, which everyone knew meant don't come back. Sophia's world fragile, but hers cracked apart under the weight of a lie she hadn't created. Melissa, watching from the shadows of her Upper East Side penthouse, sipped champagne and smiled as the scandal grew. She had wanted Ethan to suffer, to remember that in her world no one was untouchable. But what she hadn't expected was the depth of Ethan's silence. Instead of storming into damage control, like the businessman he was, he withdrew. He avoided the social circuit, skipped interviews, even ignored investors. His thoughts were consumed by Sophia's tearful voice, echoing in his mind. Sophia, meanwhile, sat on her apartment floor with her roommate asleep in the next room, scrolling through comments that tore her apart. Gold digger, actress, smart move girl, bet you cash out before Christmas. She hurled the phone across the room, tears streaming down her face, and whispered to the empty walls, "I never wanted any of this." Days stretched into weeks, and the distance between them became unbearable. Ethan replayed every moment they had shared: the bookstore, the music on the subway, the Ferris wheel, and hated himself for letting doubt steal away what felt real for the first time in years. He had set out to test the world, but in the end he had tested the only woman who had never asked to be part of his experiment. The betrayal wasn't hers, it was his. And that realization struck him harder than any headline could. Yet outside the storm raged on. Melissa, emboldened, began dropping hints in interviews, slyly mentioning Ethan's latest conquest and his predictable weakness for a sweet smile. Each barb twisted deeper, and Sophia could not escape it. For every child at the shelter who hugged her legs with gratitude, there were 10 strangers online who mocked her. She stopped writing her notebook, gathering dust. She stopped humming on the subway. She stopped believing that honesty could ever compete with cynicism in a world built on appearances. One evening, as rain blurred the city lights, Sophia stood at her window, hands pressed against the glass, wondering if her life would ever return to the quiet anonymity she once longed to escape. Ethan, across the city, sat in darkness whiskey, untouched in his glass, knowing that the woman who had made him believe again was slipping further away, not because she failed his test, but because he failed hers. The scandal had won, the betrayal had taken root, and the cost was love itself. Ethan Cole had never known silence to feel so loud. His penthouse, usually filled with the muted hum of the city outside and the occasional buzz of his phone, now pressed in on him like a tomb. He sat in the dark, the only light spilling from the towering skyline beyond his glass walls, and replayed Sophia's broken voice in his mind again and again. The scandal had painted her as a thief, as another gold digger, in a long line of women who had failed his cruel black card test, but the truth clawed at him, refusing to be ignored. She had never once asked for the card. She had never once used it for herself. Every time she held it, it had been at his request, a weight she accepted reluctantly, like a burden rather than a prize. Ethan pressed his palms into his eyes, memories flashing in fragments. Sophia splitting the check at their first dinner. Sophia insisting on paying her share at the cafe. Sophia walking into a bookstore with her battered wallet instead of his card. Sophia's laughter echoing as she handed donuts to children at the shelter. That last image hit hardest. He remembered standing outside the shelter, rain dripping down his coat, watching through the window as Sophia crouched to wipe sugar from a child's cheek, her face radiant with joy. She had bought those donuts with the black card, yes, but not for herself. She had used it to give strangers a taste of happiness, never bragging, never boasting, never seeking recognition. The tabloids had twisted it into evidence of greed, but the truth was the opposite. She was the only one who had passed his test. Ethan rose suddenly, unable to sit still any longer. He called James his assistant, demanding everything receipts, surveillance witness accounts. James hesitated, but complied, pulling together a thick folder within hours. Ethan flipped through the records feverishly. The bookstore purchases were nothing more than second-hand children's novels. The bakery transaction was for plain donuts, not the luxury items the tabloids claimed. The shelter confirmed the delivery staff members, recalling Sophia arriving with arms full of treats and a smile brighter than the rain outside. One worker even told James she didn't buy a thing for herself. She just wanted the kids to smile. Ethan's chest constricted. He had turned love into a science experiment, a cruel game designed to prove his cynicism. And Sophia had been the one genuine soul who had never treated it as a game at all. Yet instead of believing her, he had let doubt creep in. Let Melissa's lies and his own scars blind him. He saw now that the test had not revealed her character, but his own flaws. He was the one who had failed. Shame burned in him like fire, but beneath it, something stronger stirred resolve. He would not let this end in silence. He would not let Sophia's name be dragged through the mud while he hid behind walls of wealth. He had built empires, moved markets, stared down boardrooms. Of cutthroat investors he could face this. More importantly, he had to, because for the first time since Melissa, his heart beat for someone worth fighting for. Ethan began planning. He called his PR team not to bury the story, but to redirect it. He demanded coverage at the shelter, demanded interviews with the children and staff, who had seen Sophia's generosity firsthand. He reached out to journalists who valued truth over scandal, offering them exclusive access if they promised to tell Sophia's side. But even that was not enough. He knew he had to confront her to apologize, not with words behind glass, but with actions in the open. Days later, he found himself outside the diner where she had once worked, but the manager told him she had quit. He searched the university campus, scanning through crowds of students, but she was nowhere to be seen. Finally desperate, he returned to the shelter. It was late evening, the air sharp with approaching winter, and through the glass he saw her Sophia, stacking boxes of donated coats, her hair tied back her face, tired but determined. She looked smaller than he remembered, weighed down by the world's judgment, yet still moving with quiet purpose. Ethan stepped inside the staff, murmuring in surprise, and walked toward her. She froze when she saw him, her eyes narrowing with pain. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she asked, her voice low and brittle. He swallowed, every instinct telling him to retreat, but he forced himself forward. "I came to apologize, not in private, not in secret, but here where everyone can see." She shook her head, already turning away. But he reached into his pocket and pulled out the black card, holding it up. "This," he said, "was never a test for you. It was a test of me, of my fear, of my inability to trust. And I failed?" Sophia's jaw tightened, her eyes glistening. "You used me, Ethan. You turned me into another experiment. You doubted me the moment the world pointed a finger. How do you apologize for that?" Ethan's voice broke. "By proving that the world was wrong about you, by proving that I was wrong. You never used this card for yourself. You used it for children, for books, for kindness I didn't deserve. You're the only one who passed Sophia, because you never treated it as a test." The shelter fell silent as staff and volunteers gathered watching. Ethan's chest heaved, but he dropped to one knee, not with a ring, but with humility, the black card in his hand, like a confession. "I don't want this to define us anymore. I don't want money or tests or headlines. I just want you, if you can forgive me." Sophia's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to believe him, wanted to throw herself into the warmth of his words, but the wounds still burned. She turned her face away, whispering, "I need time." Ethan nodded, pain slicing through him, but also relief. He had spoken the truth at last, not to manipulate, but to bear himself. He stood pressing the card into the hands of a shelter worker. "This belongs here now," he said quietly. "Not with me, not with banks, with people who will use it for good like she did." As he walked out into the night, the air cold against his skin, Ethan realized he had taken the first step toward redemption. The world might still believe the lies, Melissa might still gloat in her triumph. But Sophia knew now that he had seen her, truly seen her, and that mattered more than any headline. Alone in his car, Ethan whispered her name like a prayer, vowing that he would not stop until she understood that his love was no longer a test, no longer a game, but the one truth he had left to give. Ethan Cole had made empires bend with a single decision, had signed contracts worth billions with a stroke of his pen. But nothing in his life felt as heavy as the silence between him and Sophia Reed after he walked out of the shelter that night. He had confessed his failure, handed over the black card as a symbol of surrender. Yet forgiveness did not come instantly, and he knew it should not. Trust was not built on grand speeches, but on action, on proof. For the first time in years, Ethan stopped strategizing for himself and began thinking about what would clear Sophia's name. He spent days planning a gesture that would not just apologize, but restore her dignity. The scandal had been born in the public eye, fueled by Melissa's malice and the media's hunger, so the redemption had to be public too. He called his PR team again, not with orders to bury the story, but with instructions to set the record straight in the most transparent way possible. He arranged for a press event, not in a hotel ballroom or corporate office, but at the shelter where Sophia had given away donuts and books. He invited reporters, photographers, and staff, not as spectators, but as witnesses. The morning of the event, the shelter buzzed with nervous energy. Volunteers set out folding chairs. Children peeked from behind doorways, their laughter hushed by the unusual presence of cameras. Sophia, unaware of the full plan, had been asked to come help with distribution, and when she walked in to find a crowd waiting, her steps faltered. Then she saw Ethan at the front, not in his usual sharp suit, but in a simple button-down, his sleeves rolled up, no tie, no armor. For once, he looked like a man stripped of power, standing with only his truth. The reporters quieted as Ethan stepped forward to the microphone. His voice was steady, but softer than anyone had ever heard it. "I owe you all the truth," he began. "For months, I told myself I was testing others, testing their honesty, testing their loyalty, when in reality, I was only testing my own broken faith. I believed money poisoned everything, and I let that belief turn women into experiments instead of people." He paused, scanning the room, his eyes catching on Sophia, whose arms were folded tightly across her chest. "And then I met someone by accident," he continued, "someone who did not care about my card or my name. She cared about books, about children, about giving, even when she had nothing to spare. While others saw the black card as temptation, she used it to buy donuts for kids at this very shelter. She never bought a thing for herself. She never treated it as a test because to her, it was never about money at all." Ethan's voice broke slightly as he went on. "Yet when the world accused her, when lies spread, I hesitated. I doubted her, just as I had doubted everyone before. And in doing so, I hurt the only person who had shown me real love." He stepped away from the microphone, then walking to where Sophia stood among the crowd. The camera's swiveled lenses clicking, but Ethan ignored them. He sank to one knee before her, not with a ring, but with tears brimming in his eyes. "Sophia Reed," he said clearly, "you passed every test I never should have given you. And I failed the only one that mattered. I am sorry for turning love into a game. I am sorry for not believing you when you needed me to. I am sorry for forgetting that you are not like anyone else." The children, sensing the weight of the moment, shuffled forward, their small hands tugging at Sophia's sleeves. One little girl whispered, "Miss Sophia, don't cry. He's telling the truth." Sophia's lips trembled, her eyes shining, but she remained frozen the walls around her heart, fighting to stay firm. The reporters held their breath, cameras flashing, the entire city waiting for her response. Slowly she bent down, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You broke me," she whispered, her voice raw. "You made me believe I was nothing but another name in your book of failures." Ethan nodded, his voice low. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life proving otherwise if you let me." The shelter staff began to clap softly, not for spectacle but for solidarity. Children wrapped their arms around Sophia, pulling her closer to Ethan. She looked at their faces, saw the sincerity in their eyes, then back at the man who had once been a fortress of mistrust, now kneeling vulnerably before her. At last she exhaled a shaky breath and whispered, "Stand up, Ethan." He obeyed, rising slowly, his heart hammering. Sophia searched his eyes for a long moment, then said, "I am not promising forever, but I am giving you one chance, because the children deserve to see that trust can be rebuilt." Relief washed over Ethan like a tide, and he clasped her hands gently, the cameras capturing the moment. But for him, it was no longer about headlines. It was about the fragile beginning of redemption. The press swarmed him after, but Ethan kept his words simple. "She is not a gold digger. She is not a thief. She is the only honest soul I have met in years, and I will never let anyone diminish her again." By the next morning, the narrative had shifted. Articles praised Sophia's quiet dignity. The footage of her surrounded by children went viral, and the hashtag #DogodShePassed began trending. Melissa, watching from her penthouse, hurled her glass against the wall, furious that her carefully spun web had unraveled. Ethan, however, paid no attention to her anymore. He had something far more important: to focus on rebuilding trust with the woman who had unknowingly saved him from himself. As he walked Sophia home that night, neither spoke much, but when they reached her door, she paused, turned to him, and whispered, "No more tests. If you want me, you have to meet me here in the truth every single day." Ethan nodded solemnly, his voice quiet but unwavering. "With you I want no more games. With you I already won." 1 year later, the city of New York looked the same. From above, towers of steel and glass, cutting into the cloud subways roaring beneath the streets. The restless hum of ambition in every corner. But for Ethan Cole, the world had shifted on its axis. Not because the skyline had changed, but because Sophia Reed was now part of it. He stood in the garden of a small estate just outside the city, where ivy climbed white trellises and lanterns hung from branches, swaying gently in the evening breeze. Children ran through the grass, with ribbons trailing behind them, their laughter ringing like bells. And in the center of it all stood Sophia, in a simple ivory dress, her hair gathered loosely, her smile brighter than anything wealth could buy. Ethan had promised her no more tests, no more games, no more shadows cast by his past cynicism, and he had kept that promise, proving himself not with diamonds or lavish trips, but with consistency, with presence, with the quiet faith she had asked for. Their wedding was not the spectacle the tabloids had predicted. There were no gilded ballrooms, no celebrities vying for camera flashes. Instead, it was intimate, filled with the children from the shelter, the volunteers who had stood by Sophia when the world turned against her, and a handful of close friends who understood that love was not measured by extravagance, but by endurance. Ethan had wanted to give her the most dazzling ceremony money could buy, but Sophia had chosen simplicity. She wanted her vows spoken under open sky, where nothing but honesty could stand between them. As they stood hand in hand, Ethan whispered words meant only for her, his voice breaking with emotion. "No more tests," he said softly, eyes locked on hers. "With you I have already won." Sophia's eyes glistened, her smile trembling as she replied, "You never needed to win, Ethan. You only needed to believe." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the children cheered louder than any orchestra could, running forward to scatter petals at their feet. Ethan kissed her with a reverence that spoke of redemption, of the long road they had traveled from doubt to trust. For a moment, the world fell away, and it was just the two of them, their hearts beating in sync, their story rewritten in the language of forgiveness. After the ceremony, the garden transformed into a celebration. Tables overflowed with homemade dishes contributed by shelter families. Lanterns glowed as dusk settled, and Sophia moved among the guests with laughter and grace. Ethan watched her read a story aloud to a circle of children beneath an oak tree. Her voice animated her hands, painting pictures in the air. He felt his chest tighten with awe, realizing that her dream had come true. Her first book of children's stories had been published just months earlier, a collection of whimsical tales about courage and kindness. The book had sold modestly, but the joy in Sophia's face when she held the first printed copy, was worth more than every stock he had ever owned. Ethan had supported her quietly, not as the billionaire behind the scenes, but as her partner, her anchor, her loudest cheerleader. He had attended her readings in bookstores, sitting in the back, smiling as strangers leaned in to hear her words. He had watched her sign copies with trembling hands, children tugging at her dress to thank her for the worlds she created. She had given him the gift of trust, and he had returned it with unwavering devotion. Yet even amid the joy, Ethan carried a silent symbol of how far he had come. Locked away in a drawer at his penthouse, forgotten beneath old files, sat the black card that had once defined his mistrust. He had not touched it in months, not because he lacked access, but because it no longer mattered. Love was not something to be purchased or proven with limitless credit. It was something built in moments like spilled coffee, cleaned with laughter, like rain-soaked walks into bookstores, like sharing headphones on a crowded subway. After the wedding meal, as twilight deepened and fireflies flickered across the garden, Ethan pulled Sophia aside beneath the trellis. He handed her a small wooden box, not ornate, just simple and smooth. She opened it to find the black card inside, cut cleanly in two. Sophia gasped her hand, flying to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Ethan's voice was steady as he said, "This no longer defines me. It never defined us. It was the lie I told myself to protect what was broken. But you taught me that love is not a test, and I will never need this to measure anyone again." Sophia touched the broken card with trembling fingers, then looked at him with a smile that held both love and pride. "You finally passed your own test," she whispered. They embraced, and in that moment, Ethan knew that the man who once trusted no woman had become someone entirely new, not because Sophia had changed him, but because she had reminded him of who he had always wanted to be. The night ended with dancing on the grass children, tugging at their hands, lanterns swaying above. Sophia kicked off her shoes and spun with Ethan under the stars, her laughter rising into the sky. For the first time in years, Ethan felt completely free. Months later, their life settled into a rhythm neither could have predicted. Sophia continued her studies, balancing school and writing, while Ethan adjusted his empire to give himself more time for what mattered. He attended fewer galas, fewer hollow events, choosing instead to spend evenings in Brooklyn cafes with Sophia, listening to her read new drafts or helping her brainstorm ideas. Sometimes they returned to the shelter together, bringing books, food, or simply their presence. The children adored them, and Sophia insisted they never forget where their story had begun. And on quiet mornings when the world felt still, Ethan would wake to find Sophia curled against him, her notebook resting on the nightstand, her hair spilling across the pillow. He would trace his fingers lightly through the strands and think about the man he once was, the man who turned love into experiments, who doubted sincerity at every turn. That man was gone, and in his place stood someone who had finally learned that vulnerability was not weakness but strength. Their love was not without challenges. There were moments when Ethan's old fears resurfaced, when Sophia's insecurities whispered that she did not belong in his world. But they faced those moments together, speaking openly, refusing to let silence grow between them. Each struggle became a thread, woven into the fabric of their bond, making it stronger. A year after their wedding, they stood again in the garden, this time surrounded by children from the shelter gathered for a reading of Sophia's second book. Ethan watched as she held the book open, her voice carrying across the lawn, the children leaning forward with wide eyes. When she finished, applause erupted, and Ethan felt tears prick his own eyes. He stepped forward, wrapping his arm around her waist, and whispered so only she could hear, "This is what love is. Not tests, not headlines, just this." Sophia leaned into him, smiling as she whispered back, "And it was worth every storm we had to walk through." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and violet, and as lanterns flickered to life once more, Ethan and Sophia stood together, surrounded by laughter by children, by the quiet certainty that their love had survived temptation and doubt. In the distance, the city roared on relentless and glittering, but in that garden under the fading light, Ethan and Sophia knew they had built something far more enduring than wealth or power. They had built a love beyond temptation, a love that no card, no scandal, no betrayal could ever undo.